Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. If you take a look in your chat function, I'm going to go ahead and post up what we are doing for today. Just want to give you an insight, kind of a roadmap of the day itself. Right, Alberto. Yeah, I see your closet there. Are you there? Hey, there you go. Right, Charlie? Yeah, there you are. Awesome. Thank you. So today, here's kind of a roadmap, what we're looking at as we are transitioning into the breakout of the Civil War. So our first piece on our roadmap, if you're taking a look at your screen, I'm going to go ahead and share the warm-up question. And as you are looking at the warm-up question, use the chat function in our Zoom to be able to respond to this. So that way I have it. So here is the warm-up for this morning.
We were in a sauna. It was on fire. In a volcano. On the sun. Hey guys.
It says on here, take a moment.
You're not gonna be here this weekend? Nope, I'll be wrestling gators. By the way, I'm supposed to tell a friend
Someone's TV was on. Chris T, make sure our TV and everything else in the background's off. Thank you, Chris. So looking at your warm-up today in the chat function, what event do you think had the biggest impact in starting the Civil War? I think it was John Brown's raid upon Harper's Ferry, the Dred Scott decision, the election of 1860, or do you think of another events that you could think of on your own that might have been a major one? So take a minute, go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and get attendance, so that way we can go ahead and get started. All right, so I've got a couple good responses as we are wrapping up the warm-up. Again, these warm-up questions, they are posted up onto your Canvas feed, so that way you have that in case you happen to miss one like the other day. Awesome. All right, so majority of you are putting on there that's either the election of 1860 or the Dred Scott decision. And then there was a couple of you that put John Brown's. No one puts anything other than those three as far as outside of those events. So thank you to those responding. Again, this is part of our warm-up question. This goes into the grade book as participation, an opportunity for you guys to participate. So thank you. We'll go ahead and close out of that. The next stop on our roadmap is a couple of things about the opposing side of the war. I have a couple slides about the opposing sides where the North and the South have kind of differing views and the strategies. And then finally, I have an exit ticket, and that exit ticket is on Canvas, and it's just a simple agree, undecided, or disagree. And then I also want to remind you about our assignment, which is on the Dred Scott decision. If you recall, you were to have read a little bit about the Dred Scott. There are a couple student analysis questions, and there is also a section for you to then provide some input as far as annotated. So those are kind of what we're looking for today. All right. All right, so today I do have, like every Tuesday, some slides of notes. I have posted these up onto Canvas already, so that way you can kind of follow along as well. Also, if you happen to have your notebook, that is also important as well. These will be helpful because next week we have our Unit 2 test, Civil War and Reconstruction. And this is going to be some of the things on the Civil War and Reconstruction. So let's go ahead and I'm going to stop share and pull up the notes for today. Again, if you follow along, these can be found on our Canvas feed under the module Civil War and Reconstruction. The plan is for tomorrow, we're going to do a little activity where it's going to be a breakout room. Yeah. And you guys are going to be doing some breakouts with your peers. Thursday, we're going to start in on similar to that viewing guide about divisions, where you guys watched a little viewing guide. That is going to be about the Civil War. And I'm going to have one for you on Friday as well. I want to remind you, Friday we will not have a live Zoom feed. I am taking the day off on Friday, so there will be something posted up on Canvas. It won't be too extensive, so just make sure you check in on the Canvas on Friday, so that way I know that you did. All right. So again, that is for Friday. All right. So here are some of the notes about the opposing sides of the war itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. Boom. Opposing sides. Now, something I did do is I actually added today's notes onto another section of notes where we're going to look at the early stages of war, and that will come in as well. So we will be looking at both opposing sides and the early stages of war. All right. So here we go. Go ahead and present. Now, as you recall, last week we looked at the hostilities, the intense moments of the 1850s. One particular intense moment was that of the decision of Dred Scott and his fate. Well, that started to cause an uproar amongst those who were abolitionists, anti-slavery, as they were trying to say, wait a minute, he should technically be allowed to have his freedoms. So here we have some of the opposing sides. Now, as I mentioned previously, we had that graph. Here are some of the advantages both sides had. So for the North, they had more resources, more manpower, more factories, better food production, extensive railroads. Again, this is all review. So this is from that graph that we looked at last week. The South, they had a stronger military tradition, first-rate generals, and they also had soldiers that were highly motivated to defend their homeland. It's interesting, the South would call this not necessarily the Civil War, but rather the aggression of the North and the North's aggression. And so it's interesting as you kind of look at history, a lot of times Southerners will kind of look at it as a time when the North was trying to push their agenda upon the South, and they were trying to be aggressive into the South. And so the South would not necessarily call it Civil War, but more so the North's aggression. And now you also see that not a whole lot in the West. So for example, like let's say the state of California in 1850, not a whole lot is being taken place in California as far as Civil War. It's mostly taking place along east of the Mississippi. So if you were a student in, let's say, California, and you were learning about this, it would possibly be taught a little differently because, again, it's not really a whole lot happening in the West because it was unknown territory and it was just brand new states. So east of the Mississippi, this is something that is very vital at the time. Here are the rail lines of 1860. When I look at this, I kind of think of a heart, right? And these are kind of like the veins or the arteries that are a part of the heart. And you could see in the North, the rail lines just stretching all the way through, across all the way to the West, part of Iowa, stretching all the way to parts of Missouri as well. And you could see in the South, not a whole lot as far as rail lines. It is very sparse, and it is also very lacking of rail lines. Something else as well that you might have recognized, that we have the rail gauges. Interestingly enough, the South had a wider rail gauge, meaning that their rail lines were about a little bit wider than that of the North's. So the train system in the South, as they were coming up further towards the North, it may not have matched the same rail lines. So that comes into effect. Here's just kind of a fun graph, image graph. You can see the workers, the factories, the value of money the North had as opposed to the South. One thing that was not mentioned earlier is firearms. And you can see that the North had a ratio of 32 firearms to that of the South of 1. So having more ammunition and being able to have that. So this is where we pick up kind of our notes for today. Military officers. Big military leader was that of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee, he became the leading candidate for the Confederacy. Now, a side note to Robert E. Lee, he is from Virginia. And he actually was one that wanted to stay with his own state. So when Virginia actually secedes and says, we are going to break away, he is impartial to Virginia and he wants to stay with Virginia. And so Robert E. Lee, says, I will be considered part of the Confederacy. He also considered slavery a moral and political evil, but he refused to fight against the South, like I mentioned, because of his own state of Virginia. Originally, he was actually offered to command the Union Army. And so Robert E. Lee, if tides had turned, if history had maybe changed, Robert E. Lee would have possibly been a Union soldier or a Union Army if Virginia had stayed with the United States rather than breaking away and joining the Confederate States of America. And more importantly, as we look at current events, Robert E. Lee, and we start to see a lot of his statues, a lot of the remembrance of Robert E. Lee starting to come down. And that is, again, because of as we start to blend into more modern history, you start to see the side effects of what was happening in this time frame. And so that would be primary example of Robert E. Lee. So military officer, Robert E. Lee, he was actually a part of, West Point, one of the largest military schools in the nation, top of his class at West Point. So military officer, Robert E. Lee. The leading Confederates, we have this gentleman to the left, Jefferson Davis, who was the president. And Jefferson Davis was one that was a very stout Southerner, and he believed in the Southern cause, or making sure that the Southern heritage would stay intact. His vice president is that of Alexander Stephens. And that's a picture of Alexander Stephens right there. Some of the technological strategies, we have three. There is the development of a cone-shaped bullet, which was more accurate and could travel longer distances. Troops would also defend themselves in trenches for protection. This was the first time that we start to see trenches being used. Now, World War I, or the Great War, we start to see that heavily used with the trenches. And another strategy is the war of attrition. And this is one that is important, and that is the wearing down of one side through exhaustion of soldiers and resources. So what that ultimately means is that they will not surrender, that they are going to wear the other side down as much as possible. If we go back to that graph where the North had more military, abundant resources, well, they were the ones coming up with plans to then try to stop the South from moving into the North, and they would start to do blockades. And so that was like the war of attrition. Now, here are some images of the war. This is actually called the Monitor. This was in a boat, and you can see here, this boat was like an ironclad. It was made of iron, and you could see the cannon holes where they would fire these massive 13-pound balls out. And you can see that it was one that was very heavy duty, like it was not going to be destroyed. This was all up and down the Mississippi River, these boats, these ironclads. And these ironclads were very slow, but they were very powerful and they were very loud. And in fact, you could still go and visit if you ever go to Vicksburg, and you can actually see the Monitor, or a replica of the Monitor there in Vicksburg. This is an image of kind of the trench, how they would dig the trenches. Again, kind of a more efficient way of doing it. You can see the cannons and the soldiers underneath, kind of waiting to fire upon. The trenches, again, were one of those smaller tactics, but at the same time, very effective. And here's a kind of an artist rendition of the ironclads, as I was mentioning. They were very massive, very slow, but they're very powerful. In fact, the Civil War, you actually started to see submarines. Submarines were the first time that you started to see two-person, and I believe it goes up to five-person submarines. Very dangerous, though. But you can see here kind of the first ironclad and subs. Now, strategies. Southern and Northern strategies. Originally, the South wanted to wage a defensive war, so making sure that the North was coming onto their turf. So the South's strategy was to stay on their own turf and to make it a defensive war. They believed that they could be able to defeat the North because of the location and because of knowing the location. This also pressured a quick victory. One of the ideas was to push forward and become more offensive, making it so that way they did not have time to recoup and be able to reestablish themselves. And then finally, the North strategy was called the Anaconda Plan. Yes, a snake. And the Anaconda Plan was like a snake to cut the South into two in an effort to slowly cut off their resources. And so what they would do is they would send those ships, those ironclads, those subs, up and down the Mississippi and along the Atlantic coast, and they would then try to divide the Southern troops, the Confederacy, and make it so that way they were spread out and it was causing even bigger divide amongst them. So they came up with what is called the Anaconda Plan, and here's a picture of the Anaconda Plan. So here's the overview of their strategy. So the North is the blue lines, these blue lines here. And so their idea was to set up this Anaconda Plan. And that's what these little boats here are kind of, or these little dots here kind of represent. And they were all up and down the Ohio River, Mississippi River, and they would surround the South. Now, the Confederate plan was to say, let's bring them onto our turf. Let's have them come onto our territory because we know it's better and we can be able to then defend it and be able to fight them a little bit easier. So the South's strategy was a little bit more different. And then the North's strategy was to try to divide and conquer. You see this arrow up towards the top near Richmond. Again, in Virginia, that is where the Confederate States of America, their capital was. And that's as they are moving forward. They start to take more of an offensive strategy later on in the war. And that's when we get into Gettysburg, Battle of Antietam in Maryland. So those are two other battles later on. And here's a kind of a political cartoon of the Anaconda Plan as it divides up. So that's where we're going to pause. Tomorrow we'll take a few moments to look at the early stages of war. But I wanted to pause and stop kind of our notes for today and share with you our activity that you are going to be doing. And the activity that we will be doing today is a little agree, undecided, or disagree. And so if you go onto our Canvas page, and I'll share it for you so that way you can see. Going on to our Canvas page, if you go to our class resources, scrolling down at the very bottom, you can see there is a little exit ticket. It says beginning stages of the Civil War. If you click on that, it's a little exit ticket. what you're going to do, this will be like an exit ticket out the door. So you're going to have time to read through these statements. So for each of the following statements, you decide, do you agree, are you undecided, or do you disagree? And then give a brief explanation, so like a 1-2 sentence stance. In your response, so down here where it says reply, just put for statement number 1, are you agreeing, are you undecided, or do you disagree to this? If Abraham Lincoln had not been elected, the South would not have broken away from the United States. So for that one, put, do you agree, undecided, disagree, and then give me an explanation, 1-2 sentences. Statement number 2, the election of President Lincoln was the primary reason for the Civil War and the start of the Civil War. So do you agree? Are you undecided? Do you disagree? And then give a brief explanation. And then finally, statement number 3, the Civil War was going to happen no matter what. It was inevitable, meaning it was going to take place no matter what. Do you agree to that? Are you undecided? Do you disagree? So take the next 10 minutes of class time. Go ahead and answer that. And that will be like our exit out the door. So as you are working on that, you are free to then leave the live Zoom and work on that independently at your home on your own. So I will then stop and I will let you do that.